Witam Państwa serdecznie, Błażej Hrabkowicz, 31. edycja EnergaCAMERIMAGE w Toruniu. Our guest is director, cinematographer Ellen Kuras. Hello, Ellen.
Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry, dzień dobry.
Nie mówię już po polsku.
That's quite good, actually.
No, but I'm Polish.
Sorry?
Yeah, I grew up hearing Polish in my house because my grandparents could only speak Polish.
Oh, really?
Even though they were in the U.S. since before World War I.
Really?
Right, they came in like 1910.
They cultivated Polish language.
They spoke, oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Polish on both sides, so ojciec i matka.
Oh, that's
But
great to
my
know.
father's parents came from near Tarnów.
So do you feel like a bit of homecoming?
Oh yeah, always.
Here
the
in
first
Toruń.
time I came to Torun was to come here. The first time in Poland, which was a long time ago, and Poland was just coming out of the cloak of communism.
Yeah.
You know, so it was, the dark days and things were starting. The sun was starting to shine.
Yeah.
On change, and long story. But anyway, it was a very interesting trip for me.
Before we talk about Lee, your film here in the competition, I want to talk to you about one of my favorite films that you worked on, and that is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind by Michel Gondry, which in terms of visual style is one of the most original, I think, and striking films I've ever seen. And what was your process working with Michel Gondry in designing the visual style of the film? With Michel Gondry, has his own very peculiar imagination and a visual style.
Working on Eternal Sunshine was a very different experience for me. As you can see, the film is very eclectic in many ways, and it doesn't follow any prescribed set of rules. And part of that is the reason because Michel Gondry and the way his mind works is very much about time and space and playing around with those ideas on film. And so, normally as a DP or a director of photography, I would always ask that I would have my directors for 4 days by myself, nobody else. So Michel and I went to my house and we spent 3 days talking about what he called the transitions. So how do we make Kate disappear? Basically, Kate Winslet, right?
Yeah.
So Clementine, her character. So we were talking about the technical aspects of it and how we could do it, because I was very interested in experimental film in the very early part of my career. And so I was excited about exploring different ideas. So we spent 3 days talking about how we might do this with mirrors, with light, dimmers, making light come up and down with pieces of glass. And on the fourth day, I said to Michel, so now we have to talk about the story, of what's happening, because we're on page 4, of the script. So,
it would be helpful to actually talk about the story.
Yeah, and what the intention was of the story. However, one thing I learned very early on, because Michel was just coming off of working on Human Nature, which was a film that was very structured, all artificial light. Everything was artificial about it, and he wanted to do something completely opposite. Of course, he didn't tell me this. He didn't explain it like this. He just said that on Eternal Sunshine, he wanted it to be more organic. So everything he wanted to feel more natural, shooting it naturally. So in the beginning, it was a struggle for me because I knew that I couldn't just push the film stock, because we were shooting film, photochemical, and pushing 2 stops is too much. I already did the test. So he didn't want to use film light, so I had to think of other ways to be able to light the film. To be really creative about how I was going to do it. I also knew that we were going to handhold every single take.
Handheld camera, yeah?
Handheld camera, 35 millimeter handheld camera. At first, we started out with 1,000-foot mags, which is really quite heavy. When you're just not sitting there, you're walking around. And then after about 3 days, we ended up going to 400-foot mags, which was brilliant because because they weren't cutting, and the studio was getting upset that we were shooting a lot of film stock, which we were. So we went to 400-foot mags, and that was much better. And so it gave me a flexibility to be able to move the other camera on set, or we were on real locations for the most part, where I was doing a choreography with the cameras and the actors. So we would see a preliminary blocking rehearsal, and I would say to Chris Knorr, who was my other camera, who has become a DP since, and I would say, okay, when Kate comes in, you take Kate, and I'll be on Jim for the reaction. And then when she crosses over, I'll take Kate, and you take Jim then, and you swing over to get him. And I said, and then I'm going to walk over to this side, so I can be on this side, and then you walk there so I don't see you. You know, so we were constantly moving the cameras and people.
It was a choreography of camera and actors.
Absolutely was.
Yeah.
Right. So, and, you know, we would do that blocking, and then I would choreograph, I would do the cameras, and I would show Michel, and he would be in concert. So, but I realized the most important thing about Eternal Sunshine is that if I was a traditional DOP, and I'd never approached things traditionally, right, that I wouldn't have been able to do that film. You know, Michel would have been very frustrated with somebody who was trying to make him go into their box. Like, I didn't say, this is the way I shoot, you have to do what I'm doing. I said, okay, let's find a way that I can adjust to the way you need to work. Because Michel is the kind of person where he's like a kid sitting there creating something with colored paper, you know, and he's suddenly gets an idea and he needs to have the fence come in, you know, so the production department, arts department has to bring the fence in, and I have to think, okay, I have to put that into the image. So I knew that because there was flexibility and because I was listening to what he was trying to do, rather than trying to impose my will on him, that's the way it worked.
You have a strong connection to music.
Yeah, I
you
love
did
music.
3 concert films, basically. You did with Jonathan Demme, Neil Young, with Spike Lee, American Utopia, David Byrne.
Right.
And also Julian Schnabel, if I'm correct. You did Lou Reed, Berlin with him.
Lou Reed, yeah, we did Berlin.
Yeah, so what is different from a cinematographer point of view, because you were DOP for these 3 concert films? What is different what is the difference between doing a film, a feature film, narrative film, and actually doing a concert film and capturing an artist performing from a DOP point of view?
Yeah, I mean, doing music films, which I love to do, and which is a departure from doing commercials or features, is, you know, they're all different, but it comes from the music. And so I try to use the music as my inspiration. And, you know, usually these films are done on a shoestring budget. So you're always trying to get people to come in, you know, for nothing to go and operate. But what's the great thing is that I feel like, you know, at a certain point I thought, okay, you know what, I can actually feel like if I die tomorrow, it'll be okay, because I've worked with the Rolling Stones closely. I mean, I've had Mick Jagger this far away from my face as he's singing and spitting into the lens, you know. Lou Reed, all my idols.
I hope onto the lens
Neil
and not
Young.
on you. Onto the lens rather than on you.
Yeah, he was just singing, so it's like, you know, all the, you know, but he's that far away.
Yeah.
You know, Lou Reed, who said I was the only person he would have let shoot from below, right? Lou Reed, Neil Young, the Rolling Stones.
David Byrne.
Yeah. American Utopia, now David with Spike Lee. David Johansen with Marty. But these are passion projects. And for me, particularly with the Neil Young project, Heart of Gold, you know, I wanted to make it like a series of paintings. So Jonathan Demme had the idea. Jonathan was the director. And he had the idea of using these painted backdrops as they used to do in the old days for radio shows. So we went to Nashville, Tennessee, to the Ryman Auditorium, which is a famous church, which they turned into a radio set, basically, where they used to do radio programs, but they'd have backdrops. So I wanted to make the cinematography be like a series of moving paintings. So that was the idea behind, the initial idea behind it. But then within the songs, Neil would sing certain songs, and I thought, like, there was this one song, and I can't remember the name of it now because it's too many years ago, but I said to my gaffer, I feel like Neil is like the little prince standing on that, the little sphere of the earth, looking down into the universe, and the sun is hitting him on one side, you know? So that was my idea. So my gaffer was like, okay, let's see how we can make that happen. So we were experimenting with these ideas. But the big thing about Heart of Gold that was so life-changing for me in many ways was that we were on the cusp of digital versus
Film.
tungsten, right? So everybody was using tungsten light or HMIs, right? And then there was the digital world. So electronically generated light, which I hated. And I thought, ugh. I hated the feeling of it because it felt like it was tinfoil hitting the skin. You know, just the way that it crackled on somebody's face, I hated it, right? And I never wanted to use moving lights. So when I was doing Heart of Gold, it was the first concert film I ever did. And Jonathan said, well, you know, maybe we can bring in a lighting designer who can help you, who does concert films, like, because Neil does concerts all the time. So I said, okay, I'm open to that. So the lighting designer was suggesting that we use moving lights. And I was like, which are digital. And I said, because then you can change the color or whatever. And I was like, I am not doing the classic rock and roll 80s magenta, Congo blue, horrible. I hate it. Whenever I see Congo blue, like, people think that Congo blue is great. It's not. It's the worst color, and everybody uses it. They think it's flashy, and it's such an 80s thing, you know. And I see it even today when there's dinners or whatever, and I think, guys, you know, wake up. We have LEDs now that can go to any spectrum, any color, right? Anyway, it's a long story, but important for cinematographers to know that. So I agreed that I would use some moving lights. So we brought in the moving lights. They brought them to the auditorium. We figured out where we would hang them so we could then design the lighting, because I was not a classical theater designer, so I wasn't making plots, right? And we didn't have time anyway. It was a very short prep. And we only had 2 days to put in the lighting, really, or a day and a half to design the lighting for 20 songs, which is a lot, right? And classic songs, like you have, you know, you're doing Harvest, I mean, you're doing Heart of Gold, Neil Young, the lighting better be good. Yeah. Right? I mean, so they started hanging all of these lights, and I said to the board operator, I said, listen, I said, this is this color I'm looking for, this cyan color that I want to use, right? A film color, tungsten 242 or 241, right? Which you use. It's actually a fluorescent correction that I used all the time. And I said, I want to get to this color. So I said, can you get this? He's like, oh yeah, no problem. I'm like, okay. So half an hour later, I come back and I say, okay, can I see the color? And he puts it on the stage or whatever, and he goes, there it is. And I'm like, that's not it. And I said, it's like, it's not? And I'm like, nope. I said, you know what? I'll put a white card up. So I asked one of the guys to put the white card up, and I said, you have a white card so you can use it as a reference, right? 10 minutes later, I come back. He goes, okay, there's the color. I'm like, it's not the color, right? And he was a bit arrogant. Like, he thought he knew better. And because I didn't know him, I just met him. And I'm like, hey, I'm just trying to do, you know, my work here. Yeah. You know what I mean? I want to get to this color. You tell me you can get to this color. If you can't, that's fine. But, you know, let me help you, you know. Yeah. So he's trying to get to the color. So I'm like, okay. So I say to my gaffer, let's put a person there, put a flag in between, take a tungsten light, put the color on it, there. That's the color I'm looking for. See if you can match that. Match it with the electronic light. And meanwhile, they're continuing to hang all these electronic lights, right? Which I'm not a big fan of. And so for the next 15 minutes, he tried to match it and he couldn't. And I go, I walk up there and and he's like, okay, there it is. And I'm like, no, sorry. It's not quite there. And, he doesn't trust that I know color. So I go, okay. I go, excuse me for a second. I go downstairs. I go to my gaffer, who I've known for many years, who I've worked with, 20 years. I pull him aside and I'm like, John, I don't know what to do. I start to cry. I go, it's Neil Young. It's my idol. I said, we've been talking about the difference between analog and digital for weeks now. I mean, Neil Young, because we spent a lot of time together. Neil is an analog guy. Old microphones, old amps, old guitars, analog. All right. So I said, what are we going to do? I can't use electronic lights. It doesn't work. I start to cry. I'm like, oh, it's Neil Young, right? He goes, don't worry, we'll take them all out. We use tungsten.
Okay.
I go, but we have no time. He goes, we'll do it. So they took all the electronic lights down except for 2. I put Lecos, Parkans, whatever, and we lit the whole show. We stayed up for 2 nights, 2 days, created the whole show. And, when the musicians were behind the stage, we had to do, and I have to say, the board operator came around and he was like, he said to me, you know what, you're right. This is brilliant. Yeah. And I'm so proud to be a part of this. So anyway, it was a lesson for me to listen to my gut. Right.
Yeah. Lee, which you directed, is screening at EnergaCAMERIMAGE. It's a true story, based on a true story of Elizabeth Lee Miller, former model who became a Vogue war correspondent during World War II. What was the most fascinating thing about that story, about that character played by Kate Winslet in a film, that really drove you towards the story?
So what fascinated me about Lee Miller's story is actually the emotional toll that her work took on her, as well as and the risk that she took to tell the truth and to seek for the truth and to show people what actually had happened. Because people in World War II didn't know what happened to all those people. And, the fact that she was somebody who was this famous model, who then decided she wanted to become a photographer, went to Man Ray, said, teach me photography. I want to learn photography from you.
She went from object to being a subject.
Exactly. And she was able to determine her own image. She's the one who decided that. And I had a lot of respect for Lee Miller for having the courage to do that, because in the day, during the 30s and 40s, women were not allowed to fly planes in the war, in combat. Women weren't allowed in combat. Women partook in a lot of the war. They were essential. They worked in the factories, they flew bomber jets with, between bases, but they weren't allowed to face combat. And Lee Miller put herself right in the middle of it. Even though they were saying no women in combat, she was so determined to get there to show what was happening. And, wasn't confined by those rules. But also, she did it at a great cost to her emotional self. And I think that, what's fascinating about this story is to show that, that what drives a person to do this? What was it in Lee Miller, which is truly complex, to be able to go out and to do that, which was much more than just saying, oh, I'm just going to grab a camera and go out there. She had a lot more layers. There was so much more that was happening within her that, the wounds of war were many wounds, as she says, and some you don't see. And that was brilliantly portrayed by Kate Winslet in her performance as Lee Miller.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for talking to us.
Great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.